Hello, everyone. Welcome to another AC Connect. It's been a couple of months since we've had one, so welcome back. We're excited that some of you have chosen to join us. I know it's much harder as the daylight gets longer and the evenings get nicer. And yeah, the school semester is over for those of you in school, so welcome, everybody. Tonight we're going to be joined by Christopher Smith from the Muttart Foundation. He's a familiar face around here, so many of you will be familiar and know who that is. They released a new report recently around workforce investments required for system building in Alberta, and it really focuses on educator voices. So what people's experiences have been and what their impressions are of our system building here in Alberta. So we are excited about that. As always, we'll start with the land acknowledgement and a bit of, housekeeping and things that are going on, and then I'll turn it over to Christopher. So the AC office, where the lovely Laura is this evening off camera, keeping us all together, is located in Treaty 6 territory. I am coming to you from Treaty 7 territory, which is the home of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And Métis Nation Region 3. The AC office is in Métis Nation Region 4. And so we recognize this land as the traditional territories in Treaty 6 territory, the Nehiyah Cree, the Denizli, the Dene, the Nakota Sioux, the Stoney, the Anishinaabe or Soto, and the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot. And in Treaty 7, it's the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot, the Tsuut'ina, and I just drew a blank right now. The Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Goodstoney nations, as well as Métis Nation Region 3. And I'm sure many of you are coming from all kinds of places all over the province. And I particularly appreciate seeing how spring changes our land. So here the grass is starting to get green, unlike the west facing and south facing parts. And the trees are almost at budding stage. So I do love that. It's walking time again for me. I'm not so much of a winter walker. So a couple of reminders about AC things coming up before we dive into things. So conference registration is open. You can find it on the AC website. I put the link there, but you can just search AC Essential Pieces Conference. It's happening at the end of May, Friday the 26th and Saturday the 27th. It is approved for both PD funding and release time funding. So make sure you get on there and get signed up. There'll be lots of good speakers and everything this year, as always. The other thing to think about is that the 2 awards that AC administers are open for nominations. So there's the Cheryl Brown Award of Distinction and then the Educator Award of Recognition. So those are both open for nominations, and you can go to the AC website for more details about both of those things. And the other fun thing that's coming up, which you will get more details about soon, is that May is Educator Appreciation Month here. We like to use the whole month. So you can nominate an educator to be recognized, and AC does that through their social media channels all throughout the month. So that will be coming up soon too. So a couple of reminders just about how we go here. So if you're new here, take note of these things. If you've been here before, just a reminder, it's been a few months since we've been here. So this is a safe space. We're here to share information and not necessarily from a place of being the only experts about it, about this information, but in terms of wanting to share it with the community and then hear responses and feedback. But we do prioritize connection and that respectful feedback here. The session will be recorded because we do put the recordings on the AC website afterwards. So if for some reason you missed something or you have to leave early or you want to refer this to a friend, the recordings are available. There's a link on the AC website where you can find the AC Connect sessions that we've done. We're going to let Christopher go ahead with his presentation, but you can always use the question box or the chat in order to write down a question, and one of us can read it out afterwards. Or when we have time for questions at the end, you can use the hand up function, and then Laura will unmute your mic and you'll be able to speak to your own question if you want to. So please remember those things. And I'm going to pass it on over to Christopher. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I think you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, thanks, Leah. I'll go ahead. folks see my screen or?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, thanks for the opportunity to.
Oh, not your presentation. I can see.
We see your desktop and not your presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me see what I do about that. Okay, not sure how to fix that. So
on
Laura,
the little menu box in the corner, there should be a sort of arrow button that says show screen, and you can pick which screen you want to show there.
Okay. Let me see.
And you'll get sort of a flashing border. There you go. Now we
Okay,
have it.
yeah, sorry about that. I got two monitors and I'm not smart enough to work two monitors, so, as I just demonstrated. So, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for the chance to present to you this evening. And as Leah said, what I'm going to do is just briefly give you some highlights from some work that the foundation did in partnership with AECEA and the Alberta Leaders Caucus just in the fall. And it's specifically looking at what early childhood educators have to say about the workforce investments that they think are critical as part of system building. So we really called it What Early Child Educators Have to Say, because the key to the report was really talking to early child educators and getting their comments and feedback on what they see taking place in their workplaces. So before I start, I just wanted to thank each of you who are early child educators for your work, your continuing support of early learning and childcare in the province. It's quite clear that we cannot build an early learning and childcare system, a high quality early learning and childcare system without you. So your contribution is going to be absolutely critical going forward. So thank you for your continued work. Oops, trying to advance my slide. Okay, it's not working. Let me just see. So I'm not doing very well with the technology here. Okay.
In the bottom left corner, there's two arrows there. So if you click on one of them, you should be able to shift it.
Can't even find the bottom left corner. So. I'm not seeing those arrows, Laura.
Okay. So it could have opened up in a different screen for you. Would it be easier if I ran the PowerPoint?
Oh. Yeah, do you mind? Because I just
just give me a couple of seconds here.
So I should stop my screen sharing, right?
Oh, I can seal it back. Why is this not showing for me? Okay. There we go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura. So I'll just give you
just
the
tell me next
when we need to progress. So just what I'd like to do this evening is just cover four kind of major areas, and then have a final area where we look at your comments and questions. So firstly, I'll just talk a little bit about the background to the study. Then I'll talk a little bit about how the research was undertaken. I'll spend most of my time talking about the findings, because this is critical in terms of understanding what ECEs have to say. And then I'll conclude with a discussion of, based on what ECEs have to say, what do we think are the kind of proposals we'd like the Alberta government to consider in terms of the workforce investments. And then I'd really welcome your comments and questions. So if I can get the next slide, please, Laura. So just as the background, and I think this is probably, it's almost becoming ancient history now, I think, in terms of talking about system building. Where it all really started is the budget 2021, the federal budget, whereby the federal government made a very significant commitment, $27 billion in new funding over 5 years to support pan-Canadian early learning and childcare system building. So essentially, the federal government saying it's going to work in collaboration with the provinces and territories to transform early learning and childcare sectors into early learning and childcare systems. And really, this was a very historic, a very significant announcement. And as we all know now in Alberta, that work's begun. In the same time as that commitment was made, the federal government also made the commitment to work with Indigenous governments through the Indigenous Early Learning and Childcare Framework to support early learning and childcare for Indigenous communities that was led by Indigenous governments. But what's important to note is that the money that Alberta received within its Canada-wide agreement is also intended to support Indigenous early learning and childcare. It's not that the two operate in splendid isolation. And then again, in terms of the Canada-wide Alberta agreement, we were the 8th province to sign. Again, you probably, like you probably sat there and watched those provinces signing off, and we inked our signature on the deal in November of 2021. And through that signature of that agreement, Alberta then had access to $3.8 billion in new federal funding over 5 years to really start the process of building a system of early learning and childcare in Alberta. And I think what's significant about that money is really the level of investment. That level of investment means that the federal government is now the senior funding partner for early learning and childcare in Alberta, just as it is in almost all of the other provinces, with the exception of Quebec. So in 23-24, for instance, the fiscal year that now we're kind of about into, the federal government will be transferring over $770 million to Alberta to support early learning and childcare system building. Alberta's agreement is remarkably similar to most of the other agreements. The one exception is the Quebec agreement. And in Alberta's agreement, what you've seen is a commitment to reduce parent fees, expand services, advance quality, and support inclusion. And again, no surprise to you now, I think, is the bulk of the new investments, those $3.8 billion, the bulk of those investments is actually allocated to reducing affordability of childcare for parents. And affordability is very important for parents, and so it's received a significant attention. But I think what's a little bit disappointing is some of the other areas of service delivery and expansion of services, advancing in quality. They've received much lesser, much lower investments. And so the example there is the $306 million over 5 years of federal funding that's been allocated to improve quality, including just under $300 million for workforce. So what that suggests to me is that if only a small portion of the federal money is being used for workforce, then we should anticipate that more provincial money is being used. So can I get the next slide, please, Laura? And what we know about research, and again, no surprise to you as early child educators, what we know about research is that the early child educators themselves, herself actually, in terms of the profile of the workforce, she is absolutely critical and central to the delivery of high quality early learning and childcare. Early learning and childcare is a specialist field. It requires professional, qualified, and well-supported staff. And in the absence of those staff, you cannot deliver high quality early learning and childcare. Those staff also need to be supported by the organizations in which they work. And those organizations in turn need to be supported by a comprehensive system with infrastructure that supports the work of organizations. As you well know, in Alberta and other provinces, we've had long-term or long-standing challenges in recruiting and retaining qualified staff. And that's been linked primarily to the way that we've approached early learning and childcare. We've approached it through essentially a market-based model where parents purchase services on behalf of their children and family, and we have more limited public investments that are available. So what that's meant historically is that early learning and childcare in Alberta, as it has in other provinces, has been primarily funded by parent fees. So parents have paid the most significant portion of childcare costs, and that revenue is then translated into how services are organized and delivered. What we do know is that in the Alberta early learning and childcare sector and its workforce was perhaps the hardest hit of the sectors across Canada by the pandemic. So when we look at what happened to the sector during the pandemic, we see it was a sector with most likely to lay off staff, most likely to have program closures for extended periods of time, and most likely to experience some of those challenges in reopening and trying to deliver services. So the Alberta early learning and childcare sector was disproportionately hit by the pandemic. And in part, that was also linked to the fact that the provincial government did not provide the same level of supports to the sector that we saw in other provinces, such as BC example. So services, and particularly the workforce, were very hard hit by the pandemic. If we look at the system building itself, what we see initially is a primary focus on reducing parent fees, and there's been very rapid changes in the funding to how services are to be delivered. And I think that's raised some significant tensions. Thus far, there's been very limited opportunities, I would say, for early learning and childcare stakeholders, including ECEs, to contribute to the system building work that's been taken place. There's been very few opportunities for discussion, very few opportunities for the debate on the particular approaches that we're going to be used. So I think we've had a bit of a deficit of engagement. If I can get the next slide, please, Laura. The way the research was undertaken, the starting point for the research was really that lack of engagement of early child educators in thinking and talking and trying to make sense of early learning and childcare system building. So the three partners, the Muttart Foundation, AECEA, and the Alberta Leaders Caucus, what we decided collectively was that it was really important to understand what early child educators have to say about system building. And I would offer a parallel. I mean, I don't think, I hope we would not consider redesigning the education system without talking to teachers, and I hope we wouldn't redesign the healthcare system without speaking to nurses. So it's really critical that the voices of early child educators are heard in this particular very important process. And so the way we decided to go about talking to early child educators was to sit with them in rooms across the province and to talk about their experiences, to hear what they had to say. So what we chose to do was to use a focus group discussion model. And what that meant is we had relatively small groups, 10 ECEs and up, who came together for about an hour and a half, 2-hour meeting to talk about three particular areas of interest in terms of system building. The first thing we asked them about was, what are the workforce challenges that you're facing? And as you might imagine, they had quite a lot to say about that. We asked them then, okay, so what kind of strategies and solutions would you think are necessary to build the workforce capacity? And then finally, we asked them, okay, so what do you currently know about system building, and how would you like to be involved in the work that lies ahead? We held 9 different focus groups, 7 in person and then 2 virtually, and we had 96 early child educators who attended. What I would like to say is that early learning and childcare system building, it's a complex process, and it will take time. When you look at those countries with very mature early learning and childcare systems, the Scandinavian countries, and we look at how long have they been involved in system building, and it's been 3 or 4 decades. So we know in Alberta, as we know in the rest of Canada, that system building will take time. But that system building, if it's truly to be public system building, it needs to be informed by lots of different voices, and it needs to be informed by evidence and substantive stakeholder engagement. And at the moment, I don't think we've done a particularly good job in Alberta in that respect. If I can get the next slide, please, Laura. So what did early child educators have to say? So the first question, we asked them about the challenges that were facing the workforce. And what you will see there on that slide is the 5 kind of major areas that they focused on. In all of the discussions, these areas were raised in some form or other. And I would suggest there's probably no real surprises to you as early child educators. And we've kind of listed them there in the sort of a sequencing. And what you would expect is that the actual challenges, of course, are interrelated. It's not a matter of just looking at one challenge on its own, but there's connections across them. But one of the key discussions that ECEs had was around the shortage of qualified early child educators. They spoke to us about the challenges of seeing, essentially as the pandemic moved out, and as you like, and system building began, they had seen across the sector the retirement, the loss, the departure of many senior early child educators with level 3 qualifications and significant experience. And that was leading to a chronic shortage of qualified staff. And what they commented on was what they were seeing taking place is that staff with lower levels of qualification, level 1, were being brought into early learning and childcare environments with very limited experience, in some cases no experience working with children and families. And so the shortage of qualified ECEs was creating very significant challenges in terms of programs being able to operate at full capacity, but also for early child educators being able to conduct high quality practice because they were in the position of having to constantly train and support new staff who needed some chance to sort of learn how to provide early child education care. So the shortage of qualified staff was a real concern. They also commented on what they saw as increases in the needs of children and families. Some of this was, I think, related to the pandemic. They commented on the number of children who were presenting with social emotional delays or difficulties. They talked about level of anxiety amongst children. Some of these children, if you think about it, these were the toddlers who were born during the pandemic. And so they'd actually had a limited interaction with other children and perhaps other family members. And they also talked to us about families are feeling more anxiety. They're feeling more anxiety about placing their child in childcare, but they're also feeling more stress in their home environments and their work environment. So they commented on increases in the level of needs amongst both the children and families that they were serving. And as those needs were increasing, there was no sense that there was additional resources available to support those needs. They also talked about, again, a chronic problem, the low pay and lack of benefits of early child educators. And they talked about how, as the economy in Alberta is starting to recover, starting to pick up, that puts tremendous pressures on ECEs who are not well compensated for their work to perhaps look at other financial opportunities. So low pay and the lack of benefits was a real challenge. And again, if you think about the experiences of ECEs during the pandemic, they were taking on elevated workloads, significant additional pressures, and at some point, they arrive at a decision whereby the financial rewards of the field do not meet the demands of the job. And so the low pay and lack of benefits was seen as a significant problem, particularly again, if you're trying to attract new ECEs into the field. This is a very competitive labor market. They also talked about it, again, a long-term sense of how they as ECEs in their work, it was still undervalued. It was still undervalued, not necessarily by the parents who access the services, but more broadly. And so they felt that undervaluing. And this was one of the interesting comments whereby during the pandemic, early learning and childcare was considered an essential service. It was vital to support the well-being of children and families and the operation of the economy and communities. But ECEs did not feel as though, despite that recognition of essential services, they saw an increased valuing of their work. And then if you add those four areas together, what they talked about was a low morale, a very significant level of low morale amongst ECEs who were feeling as though despite all of the things that they've gone through, despite all of the contributions that made them, despite the importance of their work, they were not being recognized for it. And if I can get the next slide, Laura. And so what you'll see here, I just got just a few quotes that I pulled out from the report, because the power of the report is the words and the voice of the ECEs themselves. So what you will see on those three quotes is ECEs describing the challenges that they're facing. And in some ways, these are emblematic of the large challenges. So the first one, I would describe our ECE experience as we are all just in survival mode. There was a real sense that the workforce had been through an awful lot prior to the pandemic, during the pandemic, and as system building begins, and that was not being recognized. The comment about low pay and no sick days, we heard on numerous occasions that ECEs were being attracted into the school systems, into other professions whereby they were more appropriately compensated for their work. And there was also the very common comment that ECEs are working more than one job. They've got 2 jobs, sometimes 3 jobs. And if you think again of the demands of working with young children during the day and then trying to take on a second job, I think you appreciate the burden. And then finally, the comment that you should feel valued for what you're doing. Why would you stay in a sector if you don't feel valued? So very heartfelt, very honest, very direct comments on the challenges that we're facing. If I can get the next slide, please. So we asked them then, so given the challenges, what do you think is going to be required to build workforce capacity. And as part of system building, we're going to have a very interesting set of problems that we have to work around. One of the goals of system building is to expand the supply of services. We want to look at increasing the number of spaces, both in terms of non-profit spaces and for-profit spaces. And based on the numbers of spaces that have been identified as likely to come on stream or anticipated to come on stream, we're talking over 60,000 new spaces. And what that means is, we're going to need a minimum of 12,000 new early childhood educators. But not only do we need new early childhood educators, we also need to ensure that the early childhood educators who are currently in the field stay in the field. So it's not just a matter of recruiting and retaining staff, it's a matter of supporting those staff who are already in there. So when they talked about their compensation, they expressed very significant disappointment that as system building has started to take place, has started to develop, what the focus has been very much on is on $10 a day childcare for parents, the promotion of affordable childcare. And affordability is very important in childcare for parents. But what they didn't see is in terms of equivalent discussions of what would their compensation, working conditions and benefits look like. So they felt very disappointed about that. And they were quite clear that if we're going to build a high quality early learning and childcare system, then we need to address fundamentally ECE compensation and benefits and working conditions. And what they were particularly clear on in terms of working conditions is that there needs to be a commitment to paid non-contact time. So as professional early childhood educators who are working with children and families, they need time to do that planning and preparation and reflection and so on, and engagement with families. So they were quite clear on that. What they also talked about was, again, building workforce capacity means increasing the educational preparation and professional learning of early childhood educators. It means higher levels of pre-service education. It means moving from a certificate to a diploma to perhaps higher levels of post-secondary education. And what they recognized was that as that change takes place, ECEs are going to face barriers in increasing or raising their own educational, pre-service education and professional learning requirements. There's going to be challenges around cost. There's going to be challenges around time. And there's going to be a challenge as how does an ECE who's working full time elevate or increase their education preparation at the same time as they have very significant work demands and also in many cases life demands, situations outside of work that involve their time and energy. So they talked about the need to elevate the educational pre-service education of the profession, but also to ensure that ECEs have supports to do that. And they finally commented on that if post-secondary education is going to be made more available to ECEs, then it needs to be more flexible. There needs to be opportunities for ECEs to take credentials in more flexible manner, including part-time, evening, satellites, campuses, online, you name it, flexibility needs to be the order of the day. So if I can get the next slide, please. Laura, and so again, you see in their comments, very, very personal, direct comments about what types of challenges they face in terms of compensation and why it needs to change. The Calgary focus group participants drew comparisons between administrative assistants in the oil and gas sector. Calgary is an oil and gas sector, so when you're competing for human capital, you're competing for talent in the early learning and childcare field, you've got to be able to be competitive in terms of compensation. What they also talked about is that why do people leave the field? Well, they don't have the environment that they need to work in. They need to have supportive work environments that include non-contact time. If you're not able to work in a way that meets your own personal levels and requirements, then you're going to be dissatisfied, and that frustration is certainly there in the workforce. And what they also talked about is if we are going to look at raising educational requirements, then we need to make sure that post-secondary programs are flexible. And just that participant there from Drayton Valley, she works full-time and she's a single parent. What does accessible post-secondary education look like for that particular early childhood educator? If I can get the next slide, please, Laura. And then the final question we asked them, we asked ECEs about, well, what do you currently know about the Canada-wide early learning and childcare agreement? And what is your interest in system building? How would you like to be engaged? And somewhat disappointingly, but not too surprisingly, many of the ECEs in the focus groups, and these were senior staff, senior experienced ECEs in the field, they actually had a rather limited knowledge of what the Canada-Alberta Canada-Wide Agreement actually says. Well, what is the vision that's laid out for early learning and childcare in that agreement? And what does it mean in terms of transforming an early learning and childcare sector into the system? So they hadn't received a lot of information about the agreement. What they had heard was essentially linked to the provincial policy changes that have been made rather than the agreement themselves. So they had a limited understanding of what the agreement actually meant that for them as early child educators. The senior staff in the sector shared their frustration with the communications that they had received around system building. And these communications related to essentially the changing in funding models, the changing in eligibility for subsidies, the changing in delivery protocols. And so senior staff felt as though the government, provincial government, hadn't communicated with them very well about what system building actually meant and the changes that were taking place. They were frustrated and disappointed by that. And again, if you think about how do you make someone feel undervalued, then one way is not sharing information with them in a very helpful fashion. But what ECEs did say is that they actually want to know more about early learning and childcare system building. They want to know what the plan is for building a high quality early learning and childcare system in the province. And they want to be part of that. They want their voices to shape it. But in terms of that information, what they acknowledged is that they're busy. They're busy, they have demanding work and home lives. And so that information needs to be shared with them in ways that make sense. What they also said is they want opportunities to receive that information directly. They want that information to be sent to them directly by the provincial government. And then they want opportunities to sit down and talk together with their colleagues, their peers, perhaps the fellow AECEA members, about what system building means for them and their work going forward. So if I can get the next slide, please. Laura, and again, so here's just some of their comments. And again, what I was struck by during the focus groups, and I've been doing focus groups for 20 years, I was actually struck by the level of frustration, the level of concern, and in some ways, the level of anxiety that I heard from early child educators. And again, these were seasoned, experienced staff in the field who had been through an awful lot over their professional careers. I think the average length of service of the ECEs in the focus groups, it was 17 years. So these weren't individuals who didn't have a significant experience. And they shared very significantly the frustrations and the challenges that they felt. The first one, there was zero engagement with the sector by government. Second one, with the workforce, we need some short-term things to stop the bleeding, but we also need a long-range, 10 years down the road plan. And I think AECEA has had that kind of plan on its books for quite a while now. It's been working with you to mobilize that. And then the final quote from a family childcare provider saying that we know or we anticipate that in 5 years something will come for us as a care provider and through system building, but at the moment they don't see that. They see the benefits for the parents and they don't feel as though the workforce is being appropriately respected and valued. So if I can get the next slide, Laura. So taking those comments, what the partners tried to do was say, okay, this is what we've heard from early child educators. So what do we need to see going forward to address those challenges and build on their advice in terms of developing the workforce? And so what we've got is three sort of broad areas. So the first one is that we need a workforce transition strategy. We need a specific focus within Alberta on building the early learning and childcare workforce that we need and want to support high quality early learning and childcare. And what you'll see there is 8 different areas, and it's going to require a lot of work. It's not, I think to summarize it quickly, it's not a matter of just doing more of what we've been doing in the past. It's about doing some things very differently. We need to have a much greater level of public management of planning, of recruitment and preparation of ECEs. We need to expand public and post-secondary opportunities. We had some very interesting comments from service ECEs in more remote settings who said, well, there is no post-secondary satellite campus in my community, so how am I going to access early learning and childcare? So we need to address that. We need help with tuition fees. We need to support early child educators in accessing and in raising their education. It's expensive to go to post-secondary environments to complete a credential. So we need to invest in those tuition fees for early childhood educators. We need to look at perhaps new ways of bringing high school students into the field directly from high school with appropriate supports. We need to look at pathways for experienced staff to upgrade their own credentials. If somebody's been working in the field for 20 years and maybe they hold a level 2 credential, what is it that they're going to need to help them move to the level 3 credential? So we need new pathways for those staff to upgrade their credentials. We need workplace supports for new staff. We cannot keep introducing new staff into complex, demanding work environments unless we're able to support them. And we must make sure that staff who come in with a level 1 have the opportunity to upgrade their credentials. Now, level 1, I think we would probably all agree, is not sufficient to provide the high quality early learning and childcare that children need, and so therefore we must support that upgrading. We also need to have continual investments in professional communities of practice, ECEs working together with ECEs to improve practice. And what was also raised is the fact that ECEs should, over time, be required to hold memberships in a professional association. So those professional associations over time speak clearly and confidently for the interests of the field. So if I can get the next slide, please. Laura, what we also need, again, no surprises, and I think you would anticipate this, we need to see commitments to improvements in ECE compensation, benefits, and working conditions. We need, for instance, a competitive provincial wage scale for ECEs, and unfortunately, AECEA has begun that work. Alberta, out of the provinces, there's only 2 provinces that have not made a commitment to design and implement a competitive provincial wage scale, and Alberta, unfortunately, is one of those provinces. So again, if we're going to look at building a high quality early learning and childcare workforce that is well prepared and well supported, then we need to look at a competitive provincial wage scale. And that wage scale needs to apply to early childhood educators across the province. It needs to reflect incentives for higher levels of education and continual professional learning. It needs to be a wage scale that meets early childhood educators where they are at in terms of their own development. We're also going to need substantive movement in the area of benefits. Many early childhood educators do not have benefits within their workforce. So what we're going to need to look at is how do we have a provincially supported comprehensive benefits package that includes pension, sick time, vacation time, and other related benefits for all early childhood educators. So again, no matter where you work, no matter what type of organization in which you work, a small organization, a large organization, a non-profit, for-profit, there is a provincially funded benefits package that's available for you. We also have to see improvements in working conditions. It's very difficult to be a highly qualified, competent early childhood educator working in a working environment that does not support you in undertaking your work. So we need to see improvements in working conditions. Again, that has to include paid non-contact time. You cannot ask a professional early childhood educator to have no paid contact time. This is not going to provide high quality services. And then a final area that's been raised a number of times within literature is that perhaps we need to start looking at the development of professional profiles and role descriptions for early childhood educators. So perhaps we start looking at roles, for instance, like a lead educator, which has a higher educational requirement, a competent early childhood educator leading the work within every room or a number within a center. Then early childhood educators who have diploma qualifications, and then perhaps some other provinces we have early childhood education assistants with lower levels of qualification. So what we see within the field is the development of professional profiles and role descriptions so that ECEs can see within the field a professional career ladder for themselves, so they can move from, for instance, an assistant to an ECE, to a lead educator, and that satisfies their professional obligations and commitments to the field. So if I can have the next slide, Laura. And then what we need to see is that we need to see ECEs directly engaged and participating in early learning and childcare system building work. And what this is going to mean direct communications between the Ministry of Children's Services and ECEs to get their thoughts and ideas on how system building can best take place. Who is best placed to provide comments on advances in practice? Who is best placed to provide comment on what do ECEs need to improve their or advance their qualifications to access professional learning. So there needs to be a very active voice for early childhood educators in talking about and being involved in system building. One suggestion that was made is that the ECE professional associations, so associations like AECEA, like the Alberta Family Childcare Association, like the Preschool Association, like the SACTA, the Out of School Care Professional Association, those organizations should receive resources, funding from the provincial government to organize and help early childhood educators come together and talk about system building, talk about their aspirations. What is it that's going to make them, as a professional early childhood educator, want to participate and contribute to an early learning and childcare system? So those discussions need to take place. And the results of those discussions then need to be shared with government. And one idea that's arisen, it's not a new idea, is that there is an early learning and childcare workforce advisory council that provides advice to the Ministry of Children's Services, perhaps the minister and senior civil servants, on what is needed as part of building early learning and childcare workforce capacity. And that advisory council should include the professional associations, it should include senior early childhood educators, and it should include academics and post-secondary staff. And that council would have a specific voice in respect to the workforce. It would provide particular comment on policies, on strategies to move the workforce forward. And finally, what's needed is a public communications campaign to raise public knowledge and awareness of the value of ECEs and their work. And critically, what we observed in the report is that public communications campaign should be developed with the professional associations. I'm afraid there was a kind of the start of a campaign that was released, I think, in end of January or middle of February. And I'm afraid the kind of messaging that was put out there in terms of ECEs, I don't think it helped raise the public knowledge and awareness of the importance and value of the work. So those are the three areas. If I can get the next slide, please, Laura. And I think what I would like to end on is kind of reflect on early learning and childcare system building itself. And so the idea of system building was not to do more of the same in early learning and childcare in Alberta, just as it was not the same in other provinces and territories. The idea of early learning and childcare system building was to recognize that the way we've approached services over the last 4 decades, that is primarily viewing early learning and childcare as a service that parents buy in a marketplace, and parent fees provide then the major source of revenue, that's not going to work. That's not going to transform early learning and childcare services in the province into something that's more similar to a system. So what we're looking at essentially is greater levels of public management, planning and investment to support early learning and childcare in ways that look more like how we support public education. So much more of a public system. And that's the kind of transformation that early learning and childcare in the province is going to require. And as part of that transformation, new investments in the workforce are absolutely critical. When we look at early learning and childcare workforces, not only in Alberta, but across Canada, and we then compare them to the similar workforces in those countries with very mature, well-developed early learning and childcare systems, what we see is that the workforce is not because of the actions of individuals, but because of the way the services are organized and finances, the workforces that we currently have at the moment are not prepared enough, they're not supported enough, and they're not compensated well enough to support high quality early learning and childcare. So if we're serious about building a high quality early learning and childcare system in Alberta, and I sincerely hope we are, then what we're talking about is the move towards a more professional, well-educated, well-supported, and competitively compensated workforce. And so if I can get the final slide, Laura. And so that's it for the presentation. I would strongly encourage you to read the report. Its strength is what it does is it presents the voices of ECEs. And I would like to be just clear on the basis of the 3 partners, the Muttart Foundation, AECEA, and the Alberta Leaders Caucus. We do not consider this report to be the final word on early learning and childcare workforce development. We see it as a starting word. This was our attempt to provide ECEs with a voice, and we need that voice to be sustained and enlarged and increased going forward. And so this report has been shared with Minister Gould at the federal level, the federal secretariat, which is involved in negotiating those agreements, and it's also been shared with Minister Amory and the senior staff in Children's Services. And so what I would say to you is I would really value the partners. We would really value your comments and your questions about what early childhood educators have to say about building the kind of system we all want and the workforce that's central to that system. So I'll just stop there, Leah, and I'm happy to try to respond to questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It was, yeah, an amazing summary of all of that work. So you can use the question box if you have something, if you'd like to type in a question, or if you'd like to put your hand up and ask a question, if you have a working microphone, you can do that as well. If you'd just like some time to think about it, there's always an opportunity to sort of reach out through email through AECE's website, you know, to kind of put some of those comments and questions on the record to respond to later, because that was a lot of information. So we'll give it a few minutes. I don't see any hands at the moment, but if you'd like to take a minute to think about it and then pose any questions. There's one comment in the question box, which I think, from Jennifer, who used to be in Saskatchewan on the Early Learning Leaders Caucus in Saskatchewan. So Christopher, you're probably somewhat familiar with her.
Yeah, I think Jennifer, you were in Moose Jaw, weren't you?
So Jennifer's comment is just referring to the system building. What needs to be true for this to really move forward? I was part of the Saskatchewan Early Learning Leadership Caucus prior to moving to Alberta 13 years ago, and the conversations around quality and workforce improvements had been talked about for the 15 years that I was in the field prior to that. It seems like we're perpetually stuck in an endless loop of not knowing what to do except talk about the problems.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely correct, Jennifer. I mean, I think as we reflected on the questions, when we're talking about the challenges, for instance, that initial part of the discussion of the focus groups, and given that we had a cohort who had extended experience in the field, they were quite clear that these challenges are not new, right? I mean, in terms of compensation, in terms of working conditions, in terms of feeling undervalued. Perhaps what was new was the higher needs of children and families. And I think the thing that's new, Jennifer, and again, it's new, but now it requires us to act on that, is that federal commitment to transform early learning and childcare sectors, if you like, into systems. And what I've been struck by is the new level of federal investment. And it's absolutely critical that ECEs voice their sort of thoughts and ideas on how that new level of federal investment can indeed support the changes in the workforce that have been called upon for years. So again, looking at Alberta, I mean, Alberta's provincial budget is around 350 million. It's staying about the same. The new federal investment is $775 million this particular year, and it goes up to over $1 billion. So what's new, I think, is that commitment to transformational change. And I think what all of us as early learning and childcare stakeholders need to do is we need to engage with our provincial governments and say, look, this is not about more of the same. This is about transformation.
Mm-hmm. That was what struck me about that question too, is really the biggest change from the many, many years we've been thinking and talking about this is that federal investment. And we all, as participators in the sector, need to be making it known what we would like to happen with that investment, as much as it might feel like sometimes no one is listening. Teresa Ebert, you have your hand up. Laura, you might have to unmute. I don't know how.
You should be unmuted, Teresa.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Hi, Christopher. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Hi, Teresa, go ahead.
I was looking at the reports and I'm just wondering what's happening in the other provinces that have the wage grid that's been endorsed by the government. Because one of my concerns was if we do develop a wage grid in Alberta and it's endorsed by the government, does that correlate then to centers staffing minimum standards of the childcare regulations instead of the opposite that I would hope, and increasing that number of level 2 and level 3 educated staff working directly with those children with more complex needs?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Teresa. And so I think what's happening at the moment is we have a sense that money has flowed into the sector to support affordability. But essentially that money has not been used in the ways that we anticipate in terms of supply side funding the services to deliver high quality early learning and childcare. So in Alberta at the moment, we are now going to develop a cost control funding formula. We're going to develop a funding formula for all services, non-profit and for-profit services, to support the delivery of childcare. And I think it's critical that that funding formula, the new funding formula, reflect the actual cost of delivering high quality early learning and childcare. And that includes compensating staff at the appropriate level and ensuring that service providers have an incentive to increase the level of staff with higher level of qualifications rather than reducing them. And I think there is a concern when I read the cost control framework, I must be honest, I was concerned about the phrase where operators might be looking for efficiencies in terms of delivering high quality childcare. And in early learning and childcare, the biggest cost is staffing. And so it therefore seems likely that efficiencies will be looked for in that area. So I think it's contingent upon all of us to call upon and to try to advise the government, put pressure on them in some ways, in saying that when we're looking at the funding formula for early learning and childcare, we must be including the true cost of high quality childcare, and that includes appropriate compensation for educators. And we should not be putting service providers in a position whereby reducing the salary costs or reducing the number of educators with higher levels of qualification results in them being better off financially. We need to take away that incentive in the sense that we need to support high quality. So it's going to require a lot of political effort and discussion, but I think we need to sort of take the high ground and say that building a high quality system demands a professional workforce. And we anticipate that the system will be funded to support that way. If you look at the way public education is funded, early learning and childcare should be funded in ways that are more similar to that. So thanks for the question, Teresa. And I think you've put your finger on what is going to be a very important policy discussion going forward. So thank you for raising that.
Indeed, that is a big question for many of us.
Leah, there's also a question in the
Mm-hmm.
question box. Are there scholarships for ECEs who want to upgrade their level? Getting to the next level is so expensive for ECEs who are overworked yet underpaid.
Yeah, at the moment, I think government's introduced a kind of an array of educational kind of supports. But I think what we would step back from, we would say we need a comprehensive strategy to support ECEs raising their level of education. And that doesn't just mean a $1,500 payment for ongoing professional learning or education. It means a commitment to cover a substantive portion of the costs of completing a credential. And we know that credentials, it's in the thousands of dollars to complete a credential. So in other provinces, for instance, BC has introduced a program to provide tuition bursaries for students to complete a credential, not to take 1 or 2 courses, but to complete a credential. In Saskatchewan, they've looked at reducing the fees, in some cases, free tuition fees to complete credentials. So again, it's in Alberta, what we need is a comprehensive strategy. We need to say, if we need 12,000 new early child educators, what does that mean in terms of the level of investment required to reach that threshold? It's not a matter of saying that we need to provide individual funding to individual educators. We need to approach this in a much more systematic way. This is a comprehensive workforce strategy that's required. And again, early child educators, the cost of education is significant. So we need to invest in them completing that education. And one of the ideas that came up during the discussions was that if an educator does receive a significant bursary tuition reimbursement to complete a credential, then maybe there's a requirement that they work in the field for a number of years. Maybe So we need to talk about that. So, but I think it's much more substantive. It's about investing in the full cost of tuition for completing a credential, not a matter of 1 or 2 particular courses. So much more systematic and comprehensive.
Mhm. There's another comment from Jennifer. Just she's curious to know, did you get a sense of what the appropriate fair amount of pay would be expected or appreciated from the ECEs in the focus group? There's such variation from province to province, and Alberta with the top-up pay is one of the highest.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jennifer. And so what we looked at when you look at the workforces you just identified is that there's a difference. There's a difference between a level 1, a level 2, and a level 3. And what you're really looking at is that most of the contributors, they were at the level 2 and 3, more senior staff who contributed in the field. And what they were looking at the equivalent compensation, benefits, and working conditions they would get by transferring, say, to the school system. And so what I would say is if you're looking at level 2s and 3s, if you're thinking of a competitive salary, then you've got to offer a salary, benefits, and working conditions that are competitive with early learning and childcare and related fields in school systems and other public systems. So what does that mean for a level 3? Well, it probably means a minimum of $25 an hour, but also it means working conditions and benefits. And I think what we also heard, very importantly, we also heard that ECEs with very significant experience in the field, they're not feeling valued. Mm-hmm. And so again, even if you're looking at a switch to the school field, a school-based system, public education system is seen as more valued in people's minds. So we're looking at competitive salaries, benefits, and working conditions. So a combination of 3. So probably a scale, Jennifer. And I think at minimum, I thought AECE has made a really very constructive start to thinking through a salary scale. And I think the initial salary for level 1 is, I think it's just $19, just over $19.50. And then they're looking at that escalation up to the higher levels. So I think that's a really good starting point. And what I would hope is that AECE is able to discuss that with ECEs, because I think there's some comments, and I'll share them with you on this call. There's some comments that some of the wage scales that have been proposed or introduced in other provinces it's not as satisfactory for ECEs in the field. So that's not a very good starting point. So we have to have a field that develops and supports the wage grid, and I think AECE has provided tremendous leadership on that aspect. So.
Mm-hmm. And it is a bit of a moving target around, like you said, Christopher, that idea of being valued and valued over time, that you don't just sort of currently, as a level 3, you're a level 3, that's it. Whereas in places like the school system, there are considerations for things like seniority or additional professional development. And so those are some of the things that wage grid conversation needs to take into account as we think about the career trajectory. This isn't just a stopping place, but it's a place where we want to spend our professional lives. So what does that look like? We're almost out of time, but we have 2 more questions that just popped in. So I'll ask those right now. So question 1, I heard about paid vacation for day home educators. Is that true? Yes.
Yeah, I think, again, what I've always thought about in early learning and childcare is that no matter where the early learning and childcare takes place, that professional early child educator needs supports. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, if we are going to include licensed family childcare or approved family childcare as part of our system, then that early child educator working in that environment needs supports in terms of benefits and improved working conditions. And one of the interesting comments during the focus groups, I think it was from family childcare providers in Grand Prairie and Fort McMurray, they talked about now they're having to work 14 to 15-hour days as part of family childcare, and that puts tremendous pressure on them and their families. And so there needs to be some appropriate limits around that. So yes, absolutely, family childcare providers should be supported for their professional work in the field.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, I'm looking at your questions, Rafat, and just to clarify, what we're talking about is not sort of decisions that are coming down the pipe. It is possibilities for how this system could be built. And of course, like Christopher said, that paid vacation and that idea of supporting all educators in all contexts is really important. If you've heard that in terms of that being something that people will have access to right away, that's not something that we can comment on in this context because we don't have access to every agencies or how that's all working. This is really sort of a conversation about how can we get involved in this system building that needs to happen. And your other question, Rafat, is about sort of qualifications and moving up from a level 1. And again, that's a question maybe that we can respond to in an email or kind of direct you to the, right now it would be the Alberta, the Government Certification Office in terms of how all of those things fit together. Because again, those decisions don't lie in this space. What we're looking for is a way to support our community of ECEs and our sector to get involved in these system building conversations, because we're not the ones who are making those decisions, but we certainly have an immense amount of influence over how they could be made. So we want to support you to find that information and then to continue this conversation.
I think just on that point, Leo, I think it's a very interesting when you look at the early learning and childcare workforce in Alberta. We don't see a lot of movements between level 1 to level 2 to level 2 to level 3. So we're not doing a very good job in providing those opportunities for educators who want to upgrade their education to do so. And so that's something for the provincial government to think about it. And so we don't, looking historically, we don't convert many level 1s into level 2s. They may be in the field for 10 to 15 years, and they still have that level 1 certification. So we're not doing a very good job in meeting them where they're at and helping them progress. And again, if you think about the professional fields now, the real emphasis is on professionals having career ladders and opportunities to develop their own skills and their own career pathways. And so that's just part of the universe of professions. And so early child educators need to be part of that. And what I found is early child educators, they want to improve their practice. They want to. So we need to work out by talking to them, how do we make that available? How do we make that more accessible? So.
Thank you for that, Christopher. So thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. The recording will be available on the AECE's website within a couple of days. So if you do want to refer back to this or let anyone know about it, feel free to do that. And thank you so much for spending an evening with us. And thank you, Christopher. We appreciate your time as well.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good evening, everyone.
Good night, everyone.